In today's video, we're going to be having a look at financial maths. Now, before we start, I'd like to send a shout out to Patrice, who's the one who requested this video. Now, if you also would like me to share some topic or a video about a certain topic, please be sure that you leave that into this video's comment. That way, I'll be able to generate that. Alright, now this is basically to help you prepare for the upcoming trials. So without wasting any further time, let's jump straight into today's video. So here, I'm going to be reading the instructions, but while I'm reading, I'm going to be basically explaining the scenario so that you can understand how this thing works. Alright, so let's go ahead and get right into the question. Now here, Mrs. Naidu plans to buy a flat, right? So now here, what happens is she requires a mortgage bond of 800,000 Rand. Now the interest rate on the bond will be 9% per annum compounded monthly. Now Mrs. Naidu plans to repay the loan with equal monthly payments starting 1 month after the loan is granted. Alright, so now what is happening here? So here we can see that there is someone who would like to buy a flat. So to make it easy, let's pretend as if you're the person. So you would like to buy a flat, right? But then now you don't have the money. What do you go? What do? You go to basically to a bank. Then now the bank, you ask them to borrow you how much? To borrow you 800,000 Rand. Now the bank tells you that the 800,000 Rand that you're going to be borrowing, its interest that you're going to be paying monthly will be 9%, right? And then now, knowing that, okay, you can manage that, you then plan to repay that loan, right? Right? With equal monthly payments. With equal monthly payments starting 1 month after the loan is granted, right? So let's say you're getting the loan, or you open the loan in August, but then now you're starting to pay in September. So that's basically what is happening here. All right. So now here, we must also make sure that we understand that the loan that we're given here is the money that you're going to get now, because you're going to buy the house and get it right now. So you are given 800,000 Rand. So this is then what we call a present value, right? Now the interest here, it is 9%, right? Now they said here, this is compounded, this is per annum compounded monthly. So this means now here, monthly, we're going to take this and divide it by 12, because per annum, this is just 9%. But then now, if we then take it monthly, it will be divide that by 12. All right. So now here, this then means that the compound, so I'm going to use this as M to say the compound. Now the compound here will then be 12 to tell you that here we're talking about monthly. All right. So now let's go ahead and go into our first question, right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to cover this part here, and then I'm going to read the first question. So the first question, it reads as follows. Now, if Naidu pays 6,500 Rand per month until the bond is cleared, calculate the number of payments required to amortize the loan, right? Now, these words here, these are the words that are just here to confuse you, right? But then now here, what we need to understand is that here, Mrs. Naidu plans to pay 6,500 Rand per month up until the bond is cleared, right? So now we just need to know how many payments will Mrs. Naidu make. All right. Now, in order for us to do that, we're going to firstly go into our formula, so which will be P equals to X into 1 minus 1 plus I into minus N over I. All right. So now here, what is it that we have? So we already have our present value. We know what it is. And then we know what is our interest, like there. But then now, what we don't know here is what is going to be our N, right? So we are also given the value for X, because right now we're planning to pay 6,500 Rand per month. So now the question is, what is the value for N? Now, in order for you to calculate N, what you need to do first is to make sure that you make N the subject of the formula. Now, how do you do that into this equation here? So the first thing that you always need to do is to first cross multiply this I to the other side. That way you will have I times the present value. Now this will be equals to X into 1 minus 1 plus I into minus N. And then from here, you're going to divide by X. Now remember, by dividing with X, it means this X will cancel with that. And then on this side, we'll have I times P over x. Now it will mean that here we have 1 minus 1 plus I into minus n. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to swap these things around. I'm going to take this one to the other side and take that one to that side. So when I do that, the one that is negative here will then be positive like that. So it will be 1 plus I to the power of minus n. And then I remember I had 1 there, so we have 1. But then this one, when I take it to the other side, it will be I times b divided by x. I times p divided by x. Alright, now to get the value for n, remember this n is an exponential form. So from here, I'm going to apply logs. So now here I'm going to say minus n is going to be equals to log, right? My base here, it is 1 plus I. So log base 1 plus I into 1 minus I times p over x. Then from here, I will just divide this by a negative so that n becomes negative log 1 plus I into 1 minus I times p over x. Alright, now why did I do this? Now doing this, it means now you don't have to write all the numbers. You will only get to type this in your calculator once. So now let's go ahead and do that. So now here we're going to say minus log, and then we know that our I, it is 9%. I divide this by 12, and then I have 1 minus, again at the top, notice that I'm putting a bracket there. So 9% over 12, so that was for the interest, times, now this is 800,000 rands, so I'm going to write 800,000 rands. Then I'll divide this by 6,500 rands. Alright, and then I'm going to go straight and press this into our calculator. Now, looking into our calculator, we first need to make sure that we have a negative value, and then we're going to put log. So the log that you're going to be using is going to be this one, right? That way we have a space to put in the value here and there, right? Now please make sure that you don't press this one, because this will give you an incorrect answer. So rather press the one that is underneath the on button. So we're going to press 1 plus 9%. Now I always write percent like that, and then I say over 12. This way the calculator will know that I'm talking about a 9%. Now I'm going to say 1 minus, then I'll open a fraction, then I'll open a bracket, and I write again my 9% over 12. Now notice that when you put in the bracket, it basically takes the fraction at the top like that, and then I divide this by 800,000, and then divide this by 6,500, right? Make sure everything is closed, and then I press this. Now notice this gives me a one-time answer, so which means now n is going to be equals to 343.27, all of those numbers, right? So 343.27, let me just write all of them, 41252. All right, then now here, this is the number of payments. Now what does this number mean? Basically what this number means is that this number that you get here, those were the full 6,500 Rand payments that Mrs. Naidu made, right? Now the number that came after the decimal, it then tells you that this last payment, it was a payment that was less than 6,500, right? Do we know what is the value for now at the moment? No, we don't. But we do know that this value, it is basically less than 6,500 Rand. But then, this then means now, if we had 343 payments, and then a last payment that was less than 6,500 Rand, how many payments did then Miss Naidu made, right? So this then means now, the payments that were made, that Mrs. Naidu made, there were 344 payments. Let me write payments here. Payments made, right? All right, and then that becomes your final answer, because remember the question, it asks for the number of payments. Okay, so now let's go ahead and look into the second question. Now the second question here, it is asking to calculate Mrs. Naidu's final payment. Alright, so we're saying here that 343 payments with the full 6,500 Rand payments, and then this 0.2741252 was a payment that was less than 6,500 Rand. Now the question now is, what was that amount of a payment? So that is basically what we're going to be calculating here. Now in order for you to calculate a final payment, what you need to do is to understand what was the outstanding balance after the full 6,500 payments were made, right? And then after that, you're going to then compound that with what? With 1 plus I. All right, so now how do we do this? So we're saying here that the last payment, to calculate the last payment, right, you always first calculate the outstanding balance, right? You always get the outstanding balance of what, right? Of the money that you have, or the money that you get after the last full payment. We just write this, and then from here, that you'll then multiply it with 1 plus I, right? So which means that here, the first thing that we need to do in order for us to calculate the last payment is to calculate the outstanding balance. Now, what is the formula for the outstanding balance? So the outstanding balance, it is the compound, right, into n minus the future value. 1 plus I into n minus 1 over I. Now, this is the formula that you use for the outstanding balance. Now, you need to understand, how does this outstanding balance work, right? Now, in an outstanding balance, this n here, this first n, it represents the payments that were supposed to be made. In this case, for after a full last payment, we know that there were 343 payments that were supposed to be made by then, right? And then now this n here, it represents how many payments that were actually made. But then now, luckily in this one, Mrs. Naidu made those full 343 payments, right? Now sometimes this changes, right, depending on the scenario. But in this scenario, Mrs. Naidu never missed any payments, so she paid everything as how she basically agreed with the loan or with the bank. All right, so now here, the value for P, it represents the loan, which is in this case the 800,000 Rand, right? And then this X, it represents, of course, the repayments, right? Which is that 6,500 Rand. Let me just write it as 6,500 Rand. All right, so now let's go ahead and calculate this so that we can get our outstanding balance. Now the outstanding balance will then be 800,000 Rand. So I'm going to write 800,000 into 1 plus the interest, remember, 9% divided by 12. Then we're saying that we raise this into the power of 343. Then we subtract this with 6,500 into 1 plus I being 9% over 12. And then we raise this into the power of 343. Then we say minus 1. And then we divide this with what? With 9% over 12. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and press this into our calculator and see what we get. Now going back into our calculator, I'm just going to save this. We're going to first press in our 800,000 Rand. And then we're going to say 1 plus 9% divided by 12 into the power of 343, right? And then we're going to subtract this with 6,500 Rand into 1 plus 9%, divide this by 12 into the power of 343 minus 1, then this will be over 9% divided by 12, right? Now this basically gives us this amount here, so you're going to take exactly that amount and then you're going to write it down. So therefore the outstanding balance, it is going to be equals to let me see here, 1773, comma, so let me first write this, 1773, comma, and then when I say 3486, 3486, I think that's 49, the last one, 49. All right, so that is going to be our outstanding balance. And then now to get the last payment, we'll then take our 1773, comma, 348649 and multiply it with 1 plus I, right, which is in this case 9% over 12. And then now let's see what we get there. So going back into our calculator, we already have this, so multiply this with 1 plus 9%, divide this by 12, and that's the final answer. Oh, this is the last payment that Mrs. Naidu had to pay. So it's going to be 1,786 rand, comma, 65 cents. So now I can write this as the final answer like that, 65 cents. All right, so now let's go ahead and go into 3.3. Now 3.3 here says determine how much interest Mrs. Naidu paid. All right, now when we talk about interest, right, it is very important to understand how do you calculate it, right? Because when Mrs. Naidu was paying back her loan, right, of course there was an agreement that she was going to pay that with interest, right? Now to understand how much interest she has paid, all we have to do is to add all the total repayments that Mrs. Naidu has made, right? And then we subtract this with the loan value. All right, now let's talk about the total repayments. So I'm going to use I for interest. Now the total repayments that Mrs. Naidu made, if you remember, were the 6,500 rand that she made, and then she paid those 6,500 rand 343 times, right? And then on the last time, she then paid 1,786.65, right? Which means this was basically the amount that Mrs. Naidu has paid. And then we will take this and subtract it with what? With the 800,000 rand, which was the loan that Mrs. Naidu had got from the bank. Now to get the final answer for this, all we have to do is to first write this times 343, get the answer, and then we add this with 1,786.65, then we get that, and then we minus 800,000 rand, and that will be the final answer. So now the interest that Mrs. Naidu has paid, it is 1,431,286, 65 cents. All right, and that is basically the final answer for the interest that Mrs. Naidu has paid. Notice that Mrs. Naidu has paid actually almost like a double of what she had borrowed. But yeah, that's basically how it works. All right, so let's go ahead and look into our final question, right? So we're going to read the final question closely so we can understand what the question is asking. All right, now this question says, if Mrs. Naidu wants to pay 1,500 per month, right, decide whether the bank will allow her to pay. Oh, sorry. Let me read the question again. Now the question here, it says, if Mrs. Naidu wants to pay 1,500 rand per month, decide whether the bank will allow her, right, to take out the bond under these conditions, right? Now, what is happening here? All right. So now here they're saying that we know that Mrs. Naidu wants to have a loan of 800,000 rand. Wants to have a loan of 800,000 rand, right? And then wants to pay an interest of 9%, right? Now the question, right? It's asking if Well, basically the question is asking that if Mrs. Naidu decides that she wants to pay this amount, right? Do you think that the bank will allow her, or will basically let her take the loan, right? Given that she'll be paying this amount back to the bank, right? Now, in order for us to do this, we'll basically have to understand what is the value for n, right? And then after that, from there, we will see that whether this, we think the bank will allow it to happen or not, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and calculate our value here. All right, so we know that earlier we had already worked our formula, which was this one for n. So I think we're just gonna go straight into this. All right, so the value for n, or the formula for n, was equals to minus log into 1 plus I, and then let's see what we had there. 1 minus, I think, yes, 1 minus I times P over X. All right. Okay, so now here we'll calculate and see what is the value of n here. Now, substituting everything just like how we had it, so it's going to be 9% over 12, and then this is going to be 1 minus, again we put a bracket there, 9% over 12 times 800,000 rand over 1,500 rand, right? So now here we're trying to see the number of payments that Mrs. Naidu will have to make, right? So now to get that, we'll go back into our calculator. Now if you remember earlier, we had this somewhere, let me see here if we still had it. If we no longer have it, it's fine. All right, so we no longer have it, so which means now right here I have to just type it again and see how many times or how many repayments that will Mrs. Naidu have to make. All right, so 1 minus 9% over 12 times 800,000 rand over 1,500 rand. Now here, notice what is happening here, right? So we're having this, and then we have a 1 minus 800,000 rand over 1,500 rand, right? Now when we press this, do you see what happens? You see everything is in the formula, right? But you see what happens when we press here, we're getting a math error. So what does this mean? So this means now here, the bank will never allow Mrs. Naidu basically to pay this amount. And the reason for that is because this error here, it simply tells you that Mrs. Naidu will be paying basically for a long time, or maybe up until she passes on, right? And then now the bank will never take that risk and allow Mrs. Naidu to basically pay for that, right? Because right now here we see that we're trying to understand that what is the value that we're going to be getting here, and then when we're pressing here, we're getting an error. Now sometimes in these calculators, an error doesn't mean that the value is incorrect, but it just tells you that this value, it is beyond the scope of this, right, or of this the calculator that can handle, right? So that is why now we're saying that here you're getting an error, right? Therefore we're saying no, the bank will not allow her, right? And that is basically how we basically answer this question. And that's it for this video. If you like the video, please make sure that you share with your friends. This is going to be very valuable for them. This is going to be helping them to practice for the upcoming trials, and I'm going to see you on to the next video. Cheers.